So first up, we have Zaki Wahaj, and he's going to present on to invest or not to invest in sanitation, the role of intra-household gender differences in perceptions and bargaining power. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Zaki, if you can share your screen, just bear always takes a second, and then we can get started. Zaki, you're on mute, so yeah, cool. Okay, over to you, Zaki, and great to have you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rossa. This is a paper titled "To Invest or Not to Invest in Sanitation: The Role of Intra-Household Gender Differences in Perceptions and Bargaining Power." And this is joint work with Britta Oxberg, Bansi Malde, and Harriet Olorenshaw. So because I have just 15 minutes, I'm going to skip over a lot of details while I present, but of course you can come back to them during the Q&A session. So the starting point of this work is that there are 2.5 billion people around the world who do not have access to safe sanitation, and almost 1 billion people practice open defecation. And it's well understood that household investments play an important role in expanding access to safe sanitation. But making sanitation investments by the household is a complex one, and it requires cooperation by several household members. And there are potentially differences in perceptions of cost and benefits of within the same household, as well as differences in bargaining power by across household members, and these are going to matter for adoption of sanitation investments. But we actually know very little about perceptions of cost and benefits of safe sanitation within the same household and by gender. And so in this paper, what we do is to examine to what extent perceptions of cost and benefits regarding safe sanitation vary by gender and within the same household. And how do these differences, along with differences in bargaining power, affect sanitation investments? And for this purpose, we make use of novel data which document intra-household gender differences in cost and benefits perceptions of a standardized toilet. And we develop a model of intra-household decision-making to provide insights on how differences in perception as well as bargaining power affect borrowing and sanitation investment decisions, and how it mediates the impact of a sanitation microcredit loan. And we test the predictions of the model using exogenous variation from a randomized control trial, which provided access to microcredit for sanitation investments. And this microcredit program was implemented in rural Maharashtra, where these loans were provided to female clients. And in earlier work, my co-authors, Britta and Bansi and others, showed that this intervention led to 18% of clients taking these loans, which resulted in a 9% increase in toilet ownership within the sample. And what we do in this paper is to examine how intra-household differences in bargaining power and perceptions affect loan uptake and toilet ownership. So the study was conducted in 2 districts in rural Maharashtra, which is a primarily agricultural area, and only 25% of these households own a toilet. Financing and affordability are the primary impediments for sanitation investments for these households. The average construction cost for a toilet is about 20,000 Indian rupees, which is about half the annual income of these households. And savings is the primary source of financing for sanitation investments. And this is an area where women have very limited decision-making power and autonomy. Only half of them report that they're able to go to a local market on their own, and about half of them have control over money to buy food. And this is a setting where toilet construction is a complex process with the cooperation from multiple household members being required. Financing would typically come from women because the microcredit loans are targeted at women, whereas finding a mason and obtaining materials for the sanitation investments would require involvement by a male household member, because women are typically not involved in these decisions. So turning to the intervention, these sanitation loans were offered by a large microfinance institution, offered to female clients, but loan uptake would require agreement by a spouse. These loans were provided for a new toilet construction or repairing or upgrading one. But the loan use was weekly monitored, and there was no other information or assistance provided for using the loan. The loans were provided for up to 15,000 Indian rupees with a 2-year maturity and weekly repayments, an interest rate of 20%, and this was collateral-free loans provided on a joint liability basis. The intervention was rolled out in February 2015 in 40 gram panchayats randomly selected from 81. But there were normal MFI services being provided in the other 41 gram panchayats, but which did not have access to this particular sanitation loan, which was offered at a more attractive interest rate. And we have data from a baseline household survey conducted in late 2014 and early 2015, and an inline survey between August and September 2015. And we also have access to administrative data from the MFI. And the admin data gives us information on loan uptake. And we also record toilet ownership via the baseline and inline surveys, where toilet ownership is self-reported, but also verified by an enumerator. And then we collect information on perceptions of costs and benefits and bargaining power. Perceptions along 3 dimensions: monetary costs, non-monetary costs, and benefits of specific toilets. The sample was balanced at baseline. So to capture perceptions of costs of toilet construction as well as benefits, we showed images of these 3 toilets of varying quality to all the respondents. And we asked them about the minimum and maximum perceived monetary costs for each toilet, and took the average for our measure. And we also showed them vignettes that we used to ask them to provide them with a number of statements about costs and benefits, so non-monetary cost and non-monetary benefits. Non-monetary costs being relating to smells, poor health, reduced interaction and exercise opportunities associated with a toilet within the household, and benefits associated with status, health, productivity, and happiness. And we use these responses to construct a polychoric PCA index using a pooled sample of male and female respondents. And for analysis, we focus on the 3rd toilet, which is the most attractive one, and the one that was preferred by our respondents. And so just want to show you briefly these figures on benefits and costs. So we do see significant variation in perceived benefits by men and women in the sample, with perceived benefits typically being higher for women and perceived costs being typically higher for men, but some women at the higher end of the higher end tail of the distribution. And non-monetary costs also on average, I think slightly higher for men, but this bimodal distribution for women. And we also see significant variation in perceived costs and benefits within the same household. And so here you can see that there are households in which men have lower perceived benefits as well as higher perceived benefits than women, and similarly for monetary costs and non-monetary costs. Okay. We also constructed measures of bargaining power by asking questions about who has the final decision-making power for purchases of large household items, on household expenditures, and spending money received by women. And here again, we use a polychoric PCA index to measure bargaining power. And then we split the sample into 3 groups, depending on the relative bargaining power of women. And these 3 groups would be we put them in 3 categories. So one where women have very little involvement in this type of decision making, a mid-bargaining power group where women make these decisions about 3/4 of the time with the involvement of a husband or other household members, and then a high bargaining power group where she's always involved, and the husband is typically also involved in the decision making.
Exactly, just flagging. I know it's really short. You've got just under 5 minutes to go. Okay.
So let me just go very briefly through this model of intra-household decision making, where we're modeling consumption of a private good and a durable good, which is a sanitation investment. And households would have access to a loan which they can invest in the sanitation. The household is involved in 2 types of decision-making, a non-cooperative decision-making mode and a cooperative decision-making mode. And it's a latter which is required to take the loan and make the sanitation investment. And cooperative decision-making takes place with the outcome being determined by Nash bargaining solution, with non-cooperation as a threat point. And the intervention makes a loan available at a low interest rate. And so let me just briefly show you this figure to give an impression as to how the model works. And this figure shows the surplus from making the sanitation investment along 2 dimensions, bargaining power within the household and differences in net perceived benefits within the household. And what we can see is that the surplus is highest when bargaining power and net perceived benefits are aligned, and they're lowest when these 2 dimensions are misaligned. And what a more attractive loan, access to a more attractive loan does is to raise the surplus everywhere. But it makes the biggest difference to loan uptake and sanitation investments in theory in households where the spouse with a weaker bargaining power have net higher perceived benefits from the investment. And we can also make the prediction that access to a loan will have a smaller effect on loan uptake and in investment decisions where differences in bargaining power and net perceived benefits are are large, and it's going to have a bigger effect on these decisions when differences in bargaining power and net perceived benefits within the household are small. Okay, so then turning to the results, this is a figure which is showing the effects on loan uptake. And we see that there are big differences in loan uptake along the dimension of differences in perceived benefits within the household, with uptake being 20 percentage points higher where the women had similar or higher perceived benefits, but not so much variation along the dimension of non-monetary costs and monetary costs. On the other hand, when we look at toilet ownership, we see that there's heterogeneity in households along the monetary costs dimension, with toilet ownership being higher in households where women have a lower monetary cost perception. When you look at differences just along the dimension of bargaining power, we don't see any heterogeneity in uptake or toilet ownership decisions. But when we interact bargaining power with the perceptions or differences in perceptions, then we do see heterogeneity primarily for households where women have middle levels of bargaining power. And a very crude summary would be that it's in households where women have a mid-level of bargaining power that we see most of these heterogeneous effects taking place. We see similar effects for non-monetary cost perceptions in the case of toilet ownership, that it's a mid-bargaining power group where we see most of this heterogeneity. And this is roughly consistent with the model predictions, although I can't quite explain at this moment how it maps with the model predictions. And so let me just then turn to the summary, where we find significant inter-household differences in cost and benefit perceptions. We develop a theoretical model to highlight that sanitation loan investments are likely to have larger effects where in households where bargaining power and relative preferences for sanitation are not aligned. And empirically, we find that loan uptake is higher in households where women have similar or higher perceived benefits, but toilet construction is higher where women have lower perceived monetary costs. And we believe that this is likely to be happening because women are less likely to overestimate monetary costs than men. And we can discuss this in more detail in the Q&A session if there's interest. And we see that impacts are concentrated in households where women have at least some decision-making power within the household. And in terms of policy implications, we believe that these findings highlight the importance of addressing misperceptions in monetary costs, primarily among males in these households. And I can conclude on that. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Zaki. So yeah, please do add any questions in the Q&A, and we'll come to them at the end. But next we're going to hand over to Hannah. So Hannah Uckat is going to present Leaning In at Home, Women's Promotions and Intra-Household Bargaining in Bangladesh. So Hannah, over to you. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks a lot. It's great to be back at CSAE, even if just virtual. Can you just confirm you see my screen? Perfect. Great. Yeah. So as Rossa mentioned, I'm presenting Leaning In at Home, Women's Promotions and Intra-Household Bargaining in Bangladesh. And I'm starting from the point here that we know from the literature that women who enter employment are able to improve their bargaining position in the household. Though there's also some indications of a potential increase in conflict from that. However, when we think about promotions, it's unclear a priori how women's career advancement will affect the household, given that women who are already in employment may have a higher initial bargaining power, and also that women who gain a promotion may have a higher status than their husband, which could lead to potential status concerns. There's very little literature about this question. One paper in Sweden looks at the durability of marriage and concerningly finds that political and corporate promotions double the divorce rates for promoted women, but not for men. And this question, I argue, is important given that there are many policies that try and get women into management and leadership positions, but also because in the course of development, women tend to move up the career ladder. And women's promotions not only have a direct effect on promoted women, but it might also have a much larger effect on a larger number of workers indirectly through female role models in the workplace. And this is where this paper comes in. To my knowledge, this is the first study to investigate the impact of women's promotions on bargaining in the household, both directly on the women who are promoted and indirectly on women they are working with. This is within the context of Bangladesh's garment industry. And just to give you an idea of what the context looks like, this is one of the production lines in the industry, and of the workers that you see here at the production lines, of those about 70% are female, whereas of the supervisors, so some of the individuals who are standing and supervising the work, only about 5% are female. So this paper looks at what happens to intra-household bargaining if women get promoted from being a sewing line operator here at the line to becoming a supervisor and being in a management position. However, randomly assigning promotions is really difficult, especially in such a highly competitive industry. So I rely on quasi-experiments that are created by a promotion program that I ran together with Chris Rudolph, and I think Chris is also in the room here today. So as part of this paper, I conducted extensive surveys at the home with women and also one other household member. And in the vast majority of cases, that was the husband. So I'll use the shorthand husband in the remainder of the presentation. And during the surveys, I collected measures that capture different aspects of intra-household bargaining, which I'll explain a bit later. So just as a brief overview, the first component here looks at the direct impacts of a promotion, where I compare women who were selected for the promotion program to the nominated runners-up. And I'll explain why later why I think that that's a valid comparison. What do I find? I find that these women gain decision-making power, and they're actually able to translate this gain in decision-making power into higher expenditures on female assignable goods and also on remittances. And I also see that women's self-beliefs increase. And the magnitudes here suggest that it is both an appropriation of additional income, but also a reallocation of previous income towards women that is taking place here. The impact on female expenditures and remittances are actually larger than the impact on income that these newly promoted women have. In the second part of the paper, I look into the impact of a female role model as a female manager as a role model, where I compare female line operators who worked under the new female managers to those working on other lines. I also find that these women gain in decision-making power, but I do see here that the expenditures on male assignable goods decrease, and that women have at least some suggestion of increased negotiating skills. So in this case, it appears that there's a reallocation of income away from men, and there's very little happening here on the income front. So that's, as a brief overview, I explain a little more about the design of the promotion program now. So this was a collaboration with 27 large garment factories and Dhaka division, together with the IFC and the ILO. And 200 women were selected and trialed as supervisors for about 2 months. And the factories here were encouraged to officially promote them as soon as the factories felt they had reached the desired quality. And that's quite the standard approach as women up to, or in general, women and men are promoted in the factory in general. And this selection process for the program creates a quasi-experiment that I'll exploit in the analysis. On the part of the role model effects, I have sampled female operators who were exposed to the female managers from production lines at factory follow-up, to which the selected women were assigned. So they were working on the lines that the new female managers were working to, and the non-exposed operators were sampled from lines that were not at all involved in the program. As comes to data, I conducted 2 survey waves with the women that were part of the promotion program, and 1 survey wave with the women who were exposed to the female managers, as well as the husbands, and those took place after the promotion program for funding reasons. The main outcomes that I'll be talking about today are official promotions and income, women's involvement in decision-making. These are quite similar questions to the ones that Zaki was explaining earlier. So who has a say in 7 decision-making, in 7 decisions in the household, from the woman taking a bus to run an errand, to purchasing clothing for the woman, to making a decision about a promotion. Then there are assignable expenditures on women, girls, men, and boys, and that includes such as things like clothing, jewelry and accessories, but also education and medical expenditures. Then there are remittances to the family as a percentage of monthly household income, and also some measures of self-beliefs and attitudes. So going now to the direct impact of the promotion, what's the empirical strategy here? In the analysis, I only included women who have another adult decision maker in the household, primarily because that's only where it can involve, where it can observe decision making. And the sample here is 160 selected households and 38 non-selected nominee households. And as I mentioned, the selected women are the ones who were selected for the program, and the 38 are the nominated runners-up. And this is, I argue that this comparison is valid since it comes from the selection process in the factories. So the factories here, we discussed with them first how many women they wanted to promote. Then they gave us a ranking of all the women in the factory. We chucked out some ineligible women there. And in the end, only the ones that were at the top up to the predefined cutoff were selected for the program. And the bottom ones were the comparison group here. I argue this is valid because the factories had a large number of really qualified women within the factory available. And it's really hard to tell who of those will be good supervisors or not. And even if they were to select based on their expected performance as supervisor, it's unlikely that that is highly correlated with their household bargaining power. This is also confirmed by extensive ballast tests that I don't have the time to go through now, but can talk about a lot later. The main specification here is the following here. Outcome Y for all the selected and nominated operators in the factory, pooling both survey waves and standard error tested on the individual level. This coefficient of interest here is the beta on the selected coefficient. In the main analysis, I use a post-double selection lasso method to choose controls from a high-dimensional set. And I can talk about that later if that's of interest. But I also run a regression discontinuity design and matching and do a wide range of robustness checks, and that all goes through there. So what do I actually find? This just confirms that the program indeed leads to official promotions out of those women who were trialed as supervisors. So the ones who were selected for the program are 24 percentage points more likely to actually be supervisors. They also have some sort of an income increase in the next 2 columns, even though that is not significant. The second column here is the ITT, which is 690 taka. If I look at being a supervisor and instrument that with being selected, the income increase is larger, but also not significant because of somewhat noisier estimates here. So I do see that promotions increase. And what does this lead to? I find that women are more involved in decision-making processes, at least initially. So if I look at, so here this plot shows the selected coefficient that I talked about earlier, and in the pooled waves, I do not find any effects, neither in the second wave, but I do find a very large impact of 0.4 standard deviations in the first wave. So decision-making for these women increases, at least initially, and it does appear that women are actually able to translate this into an increase in expenditures on assignable goods for themselves, as well as girls living in their household, and also on remittances. And here the effects are pretty large. So about 50 to 70% of the mean in the comparison group. And what's interesting here is that, as you can see, the effects on men and boys are basically non-existent. I argue in the paper, and going through that in quite a lot of detail, that a purely Marshalian income effect is quite unlikely here. As I said, no increase in male expenditures, a really small impact on single women. The effect also remains for women who are not yet officially promoted, so that didn't have any income increase associated. And as I mentioned earlier, it seems that women are actually able to appropriate both the additional income that they gain from being involved in the promotion program, but also to reallocate income that was previously already there towards the income expenditures on themselves and on girls. So the impact on female expenditures and remittances combined are greater than the increase in personal income, and by quite a bit, as you can see here. So 1,100 taka as compared to 690 taka here. So what else could be going on here? It seems that women are reporting increased self-beliefs. These are a variety of different measures about confidence, gender attitudes, aspirations. Can talk about them later if that's of interest. They are individually not significant. If I combine them into an overall self-belief index, they are significant, even just about significant. Robustness checks I won't talk about in much detail, but regressionist continuity, matching, some placebo tests as well, and these results largely go through. So let me also briefly talk about the more indirect effects. So the effects of for women who are working as subordinates of the new female managers, so they basically have a female role model in the workplace. And there's one wave of home surveys with those women, and the sample here is a bit larger, 250 exposed women, 238 non-exposed women. And the comparison here, or why this is a valid comparison, is that I argue that where women actually work in the factory is quasi-random. The assignment to lines is really determined by production requirements, and factories are even quite unhappy to move people around if a line is working quite well. So whether someone's exposed to this new female manager or not is quasi-random. The main specification is very similar previously, except here the standard errors are clustered on the line level, and the coefficient of interest here is this exposed coefficient. And again, the main specification, or the main analysis part here is PDS lasso. You're telling me it's 5 minutes to go?
I was actually going to say 2 or 3. Sorry, I forgot to
sure,
give you the 5-minute warning.
Okay, no, I think that should be hopefully okay. Good, so brief overview of what do I see here. The women who are exposed to these female role models also gain in decision-making power by a similar amount as the women who are selected for the promotion program, so 0.36 standard deviations. What's interesting here is that expenditures are moving quite differently than in the other group, which had some income increases, as I showed. This group has a small income increase, but very small. Expenditures here decrease across the board, but they decrease relatively more on the men's side. So the way that I am currently interpreting this is that men actually, there is a reallocation of expenditures away from male expenditures here. And on the attitudes side, and I find that there's some suggestions that these women have better negotiation skills, even though the overall index doesn't show anything significant here. It's a p-value of 0.11, which is always a bit unfortunate. But there's some suggestion that these may also be driving results. I won't talk about robustness checks here. So let me just conclude to give you the overview again. So this is, I exploit a quasi-experiment in the Bangladeshi garment industry to analyze both the direct and indirect impacts of women's promotions on bargaining in the household. And I find that the women who participate in the promotion program gain decision-making power and are actually able to translate this into an appropriation of additional income, but also a reallocation of previous income towards female assignable goods and remittances. These direct effects on the women who are promoted are also amplified by indirect effects on women who are exposed to a female role model. They also gain more decision-making power. But for them, I find that this translates into a real reallocation of income away from men rather than a reallocation towards female expenditures. And overall, this shows that there are potential complementarities between women's power in the workplace and the household, which are, I argue, quite relevant for policy. So that was all from my end, and I'll hand over back to Rossa now.
Great, thanks a lot, Hannah. Thanks for a great presentation. And as always, if you have questions for Hannah, please put them in the Q&A function, and we'll take questions at the end. So next we have Sveva Vitellozzi. Sveva, are you there and able to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm there. Sorry, can you wait just 1 second because I'm having a problem with the internet. I need to switch.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay, let's hang on a second.
Can you hear me? Okay,
I can hear you fine. Yeah. Are you ready to go?
Yes.
Or do you want a minute?
No.
Great. Okay, let me introduce you as you share your screen then. So we have Sveva Vitellozzi up next, and she's going to be presenting on Thriving in the Rain, Natural Shocks, Time Allocation and Empowerment in Bangladesh. Sveva, if you're ready. Perfect.
Can you
see your screen?
Can you see it?
Yeah, it's not full screen. Yeah, now it is. Perfect. Right, over to you, Sveva. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So good afternoon to everybody. I'm Sveva Vitellozzi, a third-year PhD student in development economics from the University of Trento and the University of Florence. Today, I'm going to present what constitutes the first chapter of my thesis that, as you can see from the title, looks at the impact of natural shocks on time allocation and women's empowerment in Bangladesh again. We know that gender differences in time use patterns are widespread all around the world, and the literature is showing that women tend to work more than men when both domestic and market activities are considered, and that they also tend to be more temporary in a wide array of countries. And even though we know that natural shocks are not gender neutral, there is very small evidence showing that these differences can be exacerbated by climate change and natural shocks. Indeed, natural shocks can have an impact on time allocation for both men and women through main channels. A direct one that goes to the fact that as men engage more in market activities after a shock, an economic shock, women engage more in both domestic and reproductive activities, and there is finding themselves with an increased workload. There is then the indirect channels that go through the fact that to contribute to the increased household expenses, women may engage more in paid and leisure activities, and by affecting women's labor supply, as this recent paper by Canis and Giannelli of 2021 is showing, natural shocks as intended as also negative economic shocks for the household can increase women's empowerment. So we also know that in this sense, we can say that exogenous shock can actually challenge existing social norms by bringing about long-lasting changes in women's economic position. However, also on these issues, we have no quantitative evidence, but mostly only qualitative studies that are showing that negative exogenous shocks can lead to a structural change in women's empowerment. So the aim of this paper is to fill the gap in the literature by answering two main research questions. The first one is whether and to what extent extreme weather shocks differently impact women's and men's time allocation, time poverty, and women's empowerment. And I answered this question by assessing the impact of a severe flood that occurred in Bangladesh in 2017 on the reallocation of time between men and women. And then the second research question is whether and to what extent natural shocks lead to a structural change in women's empowerment. And I aim at answering this question by assessing whether an increase in women's empowerment that has been caused by another dramatic flood that occurred in 2014 persists over time, meaning after 4 years in 2018. And I answered this question by combining detailed longitudinal data with satellite data. So before getting into the empirical specification and the results, the contribution of this study is twofold. First of all, this is one of the first papers looking at the gender differentiated impact of extreme weather events on time use and time poverty. We know that time use data have been widely used in the literature also to better understand individual behavior, and this paper wants to extend the use of such data to better understand how individuals respond to repeated exogenous natural shocks. And then this paper corroborates the findings of this recent paper by Canes and Giannelli, and it adds on them by quantitatively assessing the long-term impacts of natural shocks on women's empowerment. And it's one of the first papers providing quantitative evidence on long-term impacts of exogenous shock on women's empowerment. So before getting into the empirical specification, I think it would be useful to understand a little bit more of the context we're talking about. So Bangladesh is a patriarchal society where men control property, income, and women's labor, and where, especially in rural areas, the practice of burda is very common. This practice basically confines the sphere of women's activities within the household, limiting their access to economic and social opportunities, and thus it leads also to a highly segregated labor market and to a strict division of labor within the household, where women are mostly in charge of domestic and reproductive activities, and men are mostly in charge of market activities. Because of these very strict gender norms, women are particularly vulnerable to negative shocks as they lack access to economic and social resources to cope with exogenous negative shocks more in general. And the literature is showing that during floods, especially women plan and implement measures to mitigate disasters and risk, like they store food, or they secure the homestead and the livelihood and all these kind of activities mostly before the flood will occur. So the data that I use for the analysis, I use two different data sources. The first one comes from the Bangladesh Integrated Household Survey, which is a panel data set collected by the International Food Policy Research Institute and the national representative of the rural areas of the country. It has been collected in 2 waves in 2012, 2015, and 2018 for a total of 6,500 sample households. And these data are particularly suited for this analysis for 2 main reasons. First, they include a detailed module on time use that has been administered to both men and women under the form of time diaries. And then they allow to include both shocks that occurred, the flooding events that occurred in 2014 and 2018 and 2017. And the data have been collected right after both shocks occurred, which is particularly interesting for our analysis. The second data source comes from the GIS data from the NASA flooding map, which is a product composed of 250 meters resolution images that defines flooded areas as water observations falling outside normal water levels. We use here a composite image for an interval of 15 days so that we are able to overcome the problem of cloud coverage, and we define our improvement variable as the share of pixels that are identified as flooded in a 5 kilometers radius for each sample household, following the literature. So here you can see this is the incidence of the flood in 2017, which has been recorded as one of the worst flood event occurred over the past 50 years. And as you can see here, I mean, it's not super clear, but its incidence in the northern part of the country was pretty high. And a lot of households in our sample were actually affected by this natural shock. The identification strategies relies on a difference in difference methodology. So where our outcome of interest are the variables measured in minutes for time allocation, the women's likelihood of being employed in paid activities, and the women's empowerment as measured through the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index for each individual I in household H in region R at time T. Beta 1 is the coefficient of the treatment that gives us the difference in the outcome of interest after the flood between the treatment and the control group. And following the literature again, I also add this control variable that gives us the household propensity to be inundated in normal times. I have added then regional fixed effects, individual fixed effects, monthly dummy variables to control for the month of the interview, and then individual and household characteristics. So these are the results from the main analysis that look at the impact of the flood of 2017 on time allocation. As we can see, it seems that the impact of the flood is operating through the indirect channel. As women are more likely to engage in paid activities and their empowerment increases. And what is particularly interesting in these results is that women actually decrease by almost 1 hour the time spent in domestic activities, they increase their leisure activities, and they are less likely to be time poor, while men actually substitute for women's work within the household by increasing their share of work within the household by almost 1 hour. They decrease their time spent in market activities, and they are more likely to be time poor. So these results are suggesting and are in line of a paper with a paper by Anderson and S. Brown of 2009 on female autonomy in Bangladesh, that as women's engagement in paid activities increases, they spend less time in domestic work and they enjoy more their leisure activities, while men, on the other hand, substitute for the work within the household. As I was these results are pretty interesting to better understand what's going on. I also conducted an heterogeneity analysis by dividing my sample into different subsamples, those individuals that experienced both flooding and those individuals that experienced the flood only in 2017. As we can see here, these are the results for women. Results are very different for the two groups of women. So for those women that experienced both flooding events, the results, the aforementioned results, are actually corroborated, and they reduce their time spent in domestic work, increase their time in leisure activities. They're more likely to be engaged in paid activities and less likely to be time poor. While for women that experience only the flooding in 2017, results are way different. So they increase their time in domestic work, decrease their time in market activities, and they are way more likely to be time poor. And when we look at what happens to men, results are a little bit less striking, but still we can see that they are different. They are different based on whether they experience both events or not. So these results, I didn't really dig too much into them yet, but they kind of suggest some sort of the existence of some sort of adaptive capacity, because it seems that individuals that have already experienced the flood in 2014, in 2017, they seem to be more prepared and to react differently. As here is not present, but we can see that also from the control variable of the propensity to be inundated in normal times. Then I look at the impact of the flood in 2014 on women's empowerment in the sample all men giving women's.
Sveva, you're breaking up a little bit for me. Is that also true for you, Anna?
Sorry.
Possibly try turning off your video, and because it's been fine up until this moment, so hopefully it will sort itself out again. It's still breaking up a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, try talking now. I think it's probably better. Oh, maybe you're switching internet or something. Okay, let's hold on for a second. Okay, Sveva, I think you're back. But you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Let me just, yeah.
The sound was perfect up until that last minute.
Okay.
So hopefully it'll be fine for us.
That's good to know.
And you have just under 5 minutes.
Okay, can you see now?
I can see your screen, yeah.
Okay,
You sound good.
thank you. Sorry for the...
No worries at all.
Okay, so yes, we can see from this table, the flood in 2014 still has a positive and significant impact on women's empowerment and on their likelihood of being engaged in paid activities. And when we look at, when we divide the sample from those women that experience both flooding and those that experience only the flood in 2014 now, results are a little bit different, but they're still very interesting in my opinion, as for those women that experience both flooding events, their women's empowerment is still increasing significantly, even though only at 10%. And their likelihood of being engaged in paid activities is not significant anymore, but still not decreasing. While for those women that experience only the flood in 2014, we see that their likelihood of being engaged in paid activities significantly decrease, but their empowerment levels actually remain stable over time. So such results suggest that first, women's engagement in paid activities is strictly related to a specific period of time. So it seems that it's more of a risk of a coping strategy that they have, like, to contribute to the increased household expenses in the short period right after the natural shock. And then for women, and then it's interesting to see that for women that were exposed only to the flood in 2014, actually their empowerment level in 2018, it does not decrease along with the probability of engaging in paid activities, but it has remained stable after the shock. So these results confirm the hypothesis of the paper by Canessa and Giannelli that natural shocks can lead to an increase in women's empowerment that would have not happened otherwise. And they add on them by showing that these negative economic shocks can trigger a persistent change in women's empowerment that would have not happened otherwise. Of course, this doesn't mean that negative economic shocks are good, but still it's interesting to better understand also their spillover effects, let's say. So I then ran some robustness check that I will not show to you now, with using different definition of the treatment, using self-report data versus GIS data, and then I tried to test the parallel trends assumption as I'm employing a difference in difference methodology. I ran first balance check at baselines to look at to check for mean differences between treated and untreated individuals. And then following the literature, I ran a placebo test for the first two waves, where I basically replicate the benchmark strategy as if the flood hit in 2015. So it's exactly the same specification, just the time changes. And as we can see from this table, it seems that parallel trends assumption is confirmed, except for very few variables. So to sum up, we have seen that the flood of 2017 has led to a significant change in time allocation for women and men, and that individuals are reacting differently to the shock in 2017, depending on whether they were affected by the flood in 2014 or not. We have seen that the flood in 2014 has led to a structural change in women's empowerment that persists over time, and all these results can have important implications for policymakers and development practitioners, as they're showing that how individuals are reacting after natural shocks burst, how they reallocate their time, and that especially that once women's empowerment increases, especially due to a higher participation in the labor market, actually this increase persists over time. So it's important results for gender-specific intervention designed to increase women's ability to cope with shocks, to strengthen their empowerment, and to enhance also their adaptive capacity. Then, of course, any comment at this stage of the study is highly welcome, especially if some of you know a little bit better about also the context and whether this can make actual sense or not. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Sveva. Thanks to you and to all of our presenters. So we have about 20 minutes now for questions. I think the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go paper by paper. So we'll start with you, Zaki, and we'll have a few minutes for questions for each of you. And to everyone in the audience as well, please do keep submitting questions in the Q&A. So Zaki, let's go to you first. And the first question we have is from Annemie Mertens. So Annemie, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, Zaki. Thank you for your presentation. I had two small questions. The first one was regarding the context. One of the hassles of having no bathroom, well, hassles is an understatement, of having no bathroom in the house is that you need to take your children quite often to the forest or to the fields. Do you have a sense of the responsibilities of women in the area regarding this? Do the children go by themselves? Do they take them? Because I'm just thinking in terms of a cost, that is possibly a significant cost, having to do that probably quite frequently when children are young. And the second question is a question on data. So the different perceptions on monetary costs when you show the, I think, the kind of the two kernel type distributions, immediately suggested that there was some degree of, like you were saying, incomplete information there. And you touched upon that in the conclusion again, because you would assume that toilet costs, once you get a builder to do this in your village, the cost is probably going to be relatively fixed in the sense that it's going to be a particular cost that is basically kind of, it is what it is. And this seems to me to suggest a degree of incomplete information, which is different between husband and wife. And given the kind of more recent literature on how men and women communicate about sometimes factual realities around them, on the fact that we now know, for instance, that if the woman would tell the husband something, well, I've learned this, that the men are less likely to believe the woman than the other way around. Kind of how do you kind of see that? Because it looks like this is a main driver in some of your results, the fact that the men might possibly overestimate the cost while the women might actually have a more accurate estimate of the cost.
Thanks, Annemie. So let me start with the second question. So my sense is that because these questions were asked at baseline, before they have taken the steps to make the sanitation investments, they have limited knowledge at that point. And that's why we get this widespread in, their minimum expected cost and the maximum expected cost has a wide range. And we see that this for both men and women. So they're quite ill-informed at that point. But that's the information state that's relevant for us, because that's when they're bargaining over whether to take the loan and whether to make the sanitation investments. So we can assume that once they make those steps and they start looking into the construction options, the mason options, then they become much better informed. It's probably the case that so my prior would have been that the male would have household member would be better informed than the female household member, because he's more closely connected with these market activities, but that doesn't seem to be the case from our data. I think so. What you mentioned, Annemie, about communication from the female household member to the male household member and vice versa, and how convincingly they can relay this information, I think is a very important point. And it's probably related to how this kind of information should be communicated in the future. But I think what we're seeing in the baseline is that there's lack of information from both parties. And on the second point, so I think that's probably true that for infants and toddlers, it's probably quite a hassle to help them relieve themselves. But I also wonder whether they're taken, so whether the norm requires them to be taken as far from the house for the for toilet purposes. But if my co-author Bansi is around, I will suggest that she respond to both of these points as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Anami. Thanks for your questions. So I'll start with the first one on children and so on. So typically with very young children, they would just be in the compound, near the compound, and more or less relieve themselves when they need it. I think older children, they would possibly go on their own or be accompanied, or go in groups, or be accompanied by mom and dad in the mornings and the evenings or something. So for the very young children, it's mostly around near the house. And with actually getting a toilet, there is more work for women in terms of keeping it clean and getting water to maintain it and so on. And I think on the question, on the second one, I think Zaki, I don't have anything further to add compared to what Zaki said. So thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hanami, and thanks, Zaki and Bansi. So I'll go to one quick question from you, Hannah, and then I'll move on to questions for you, Hannah. So your question for Zaki, Hannah, first.
Yeah, thanks, Rossa. Zaki, I was wondering whether you have any data, thinking towards Cheryl Duster's work as well, about how the responses within the household compare. So if like the net benefits or they agree, or whether they diverge a lot within the household, or whether you have any data about someone's perceptions about the other's perceptions, and how accurate those are. So whether you're able to look into these interrelations and attitudes in the household there.
So thanks for that, Hannah. So on differences in intra-household differences in perceptions, so we see that there is actually quite a lot of variation along all three dimensions that we measured. And so I had a slide on that I showed very quickly. And so there we have all different categories where the man has lower benefit perceptions than the woman. They have similar benefit perceptions. The man has higher benefit perceptions. And the same when it comes to cost perceptions. I don't think the survey asked about one household member's perception about the other household member's perception, which I think is potentially interesting. But we don't have that information. It's because we have all of this variation in perceptions within the household that we're able to do our heterogeneity analysis. And yes, they have these heterogeneous effects on the of the effects of the intervention, as I showed. Bansi, do you have anything to add to that?
No. I think we didn't ask about second order beliefs. So.
Okay, great, thanks. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to a couple of questions we have for Hannah, and then we'll do some for Sveva as well. And then if we have time, we might come back to further questions on each of the papers. So Hannah, we had a question submitted from Hiroyuki Igami, and Hiroyuki was asking, I'm interested in which families the ladies send remittances to, or the women send remittances to. I mean, they may send money to their original family or their husband's family. Is the intervention affecting this aspect? So is there a gender difference between where the remittances go?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I didn't have time to go into that, but I do show it in the paper. So it seems that most of the remittances are going to the husband's family. But what's interesting about that is that there are some sample size issues, but it seems to be driven by children who live outside the household. So the remittances are especially large if the woman's children live outside the household with the in-laws family. So in some ways that could mask transfers to children again in that case. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And Zaki, you had a question for Hannah as well. Do you want to ask that?
Yes, Hannah. So I was wondering whether you have any information on hours worked and so whether hours work changed after the women were promoted and whether the hours become more convenient for them, because that could have an effect on intra-household dynamics if her hours become more convenient and she's able to reap certain advantages within the household as a result of that.
Yeah, sorry, trouble with that. I'm mute. I do. And interestingly, there's not a big difference in hours spent at work. So it's the supervisors set up in the morning and finish up at work. So it's at least in the ITT, it's only about I think 15 minutes that they stay longer. And I don't find any impacts on time use on that front. So I don't think it doesn't seem that that's what's driving any of those. Yeah.
So I had a related question actually, Hannah. So you had this statistically significant effect on whether the women were promoted in your first analysis, but then not on their income. And so I was wondering whether that was to do with hours or maybe the promotion doesn't come with an increase in pay per hour. Or maybe it's just a thing to do with the data, like the income data is a lot noisier and so you have less power. Did you know which of the explanations it is?
I think it's partly all of those. Partly it is because the income data is definitely noisier because some gain, there are a few at least who drop out of the labour force, so that goes down to zero. So there's just quite a high standard deviation there. I think that's certainly part of what's driving. On the other hand, there's also these women who are promoted from being like a high level operator to being a supervisor. At least initially, the increase is not that large, and I think that's partly what we've heard also in the factories and in the program, that women are like, is this really worth the responsibility increase? So because as an operator, they get more boni and incentives than supervisors. So it's the income increase as such is not that large in itself as well, but there are also data issues there.
So I think that in itself is really interesting because it seems that the bargaining power is not coming from the income, because you have the other results where women, before they get the actual promotion, but the promotion's been announced, their bargaining power increases. So that, I mean, to me, that kind of seems surprising, but a really interesting result. Cool. Sveva, you had a question, I think, as well for Hannah.
Yeah, thank you. I just have two very quick questions. I was wondering if you have any data and information on potential negative spillover effects, especially domestic violence, as we know that sometimes like increased bargaining power within the household can lead also to negative effects that we don't really think about. And also I was wondering if like the data on beliefs and gender attitudes, if you have something on men too. I mean, if we can, it would be interesting, I don't know if you collected the data, but to check whether there are changing also within the feminine beliefs, not only by the part of women, but also by the part of men. Thank you.
Yeah, so on that, I don't see anything moving on the IPV front. I only have a very short, 2 questions about that. Has the woman been slapped or beaten in the last 5 months? And there was no movement there. Similarly, on the men's attitude fronts, I have that from the husband's data, but there's nothing moving there from my recollection last time I looked at it.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, Sveva. Let's move on to questions for you, Sveva, and then we'll see if we have time to take any additional ones. So Zaki, do you want to lead off with your question for Sveva?
Yes, so hi Sveva. So I think the results are quite striking because flooding is supposed to be a temporary shock, and so it's striking to see that it has these persistent effects. And one reason it can have persistent effects is because it affects productive assets of these households. If the flooding led a household to sell off land, or it destroyed livestock, So I was wondering if you have data on asset ownership and whether flooding affected asset ownership during the subsequent period.
Thank you, Zaki. Yeah, I have data on asset ownership. I've included in the analysis as control variables like the assets, agricultural assets and livestock as well as other kind of assets like items that can actually foster like the household production function. But yeah, I don't know, it could be interesting to see whether like there are different like ownerships between men and between spouses, husband and wives, and whether this changed something. But mostly I think what's working here is like they collected data right after, like from 3 months to 9 months after the flood occurred. And what I wanted to do like in the next steps is to look at differences in the sample, like whether data were collected after 3 months, after 6, and after 9, and see whether there are differences in results. But otherwise, it seems like that is going mainly to the fact that women start working more and start engaging more in paid activities to cope in the short time with this negative economic shock. This is the main, like, I think that's the thing that makes more sense. Also, it's not the first. It's not the first study finding also these results. There is another study looking at the impact of the flood in 2014 that shows that women start engaging more in paid activities. So I think that this is mainly going through that. But then that's also the limit of secondary data. I mean, we cannot really be the perfect story, unfortunately. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Sveva. Thanks, Zaki. So I had a question, and it was about the mechanisms, and in particular on the results comparing the groups where they have suffered 2 floods versus a group who suffered only 1 flood. So this seems counterintuitive to me at first. Like, my naive guess was like, if the household is re-optimizing after the first flood, then they've already changed their bargaining power after flood 1, and so then the effect of the second flood should be less because they've already readjusted. But you found the opposite. You found that households who suffered the second flood had like a bigger adjustment after it. And so I was wondering if you have an idea of what might be driving that. And then my best guess was something like the gender roles are kind of broken in a time of crisis because you don't like have the luxury of having gender roles. Like everyone it has to be all hands to the pump or something. And everyone has to work hard, and maybe the men appreciate the work that the women do more in a time of crisis. Does that seem right? Or do you think there's something else going on?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I didn't show in the tables whether it was like it was complicated, but there are interesting results also from the control variable that I added, like as the probability of being flooded in normal times. So I took as normal times the whole month before the flooding occurred, and what was like this variable was showing that it seemed that women that experienced both flood, actually they were as if they were preparing for the second one. So they increased their time spent in domestic work and they became more thankful during that period than women that did not experience the flood in 2014. So it seems that's why it's like, it seems there can be some sort of adaptive capacity there. You already know what you have to do in order to be, of course, then a flood, it's like, I mean, you are affected anyhow, but in order to cope at best with such a shock, you already know what you have to do, and you do it before the real flood is occurring. And so maybe you manage then to, like, right after the period to, I don't know, yeah, allocate their time in a different way. And for the gender norms, there may be something there as well. Unfortunately, in the data, there is no information about gender attitudes or gender norms. The only thing that we can see is through the impact of the like long-term impact on women's empowerment. As we can see, also women keep being like more empowered. So even though they are not really engaging more in paid activities, but we could think that is going through also this channel. As women are more empowered, the men tend to cooperate a little bit more within the household than to have them out in domestic activities. That's what I'm thinking. But then and trying to get in contact also with other like social scientists to understand whether it's makes sense or not for that particular context, because of course it's
yeah, cool, thanks. And then I have one other question. So on your very last slide, you mentioned policy implications, and I was thinking, what would the policy implications be? And maybe this is linked to the mechanisms.
Empower women. No, well, it would be mostly then rural Bangladesh. It's a really, as I said, like for what I read, I've never been to Bangladesh before. So for what I read, the gender norms are very strict. So what happens to be like the best solution is just to try to increase women access to labor market, and the positive message is just that as women empowerment increase, it seems to persist over time, that this increase in women's empowerment seems to persist over time. And this other paper was showing that the increase in women's empowerment was coming exactly by the fact that women were working more after the flood in 2014. So it's mainly trying to having them like gain a little bit more of economic autonomy, and also start working, of course, increases your self-efficacy and has a lot of positive impact on your empowerment more generally. But yeah, mainly this, and then to understand that men and women react differently to natural shocks, and that we should think about designing gender driving policies, so especially in countries where natural shocks are very common, and they are becoming increasingly common. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Sveva. Does anyone else have any questions for Sveva or anyone? And if not, I have one I wanted to ask Zaki and didn't have a chance to, which I'll circle back to, but I'll open the floor before I take the chair's prerogative. Cool. Okay, so thanks very much, Sveva. I'm just going to ask one more question to Zaki, and then I think we'll wrap up. So Zaki, my question was about like, are there gender-specific norms that are driving some of your results here? And then I was thinking about kind of spillovers between households. So in your model, my understanding of it was you kind of have a household public good, but you're treating each household individually. And I was wondering, like, do you get norms that spread among women within the same community or among men within the same community? And I kind of thought of three types of spillovers. So the norms, maybe information spreads in different networks if the networks are very gendered. And then possibly like just their health spillovers in some way, like maybe one gender is more aware of their health spillovers of sanitation than the other gender. So yeah, I'm not sure this is a very well-formed question. It's more a collection of thoughts about norms and spillovers between households in the community and the extent to which they're gendered, which might explain your results.
So thanks for that, Rossa. Bansi and I actually have a student who is looking at spillovers in terms of practice, so defecation practices. And it does seem like that there are, spillovers via networks defined in different ways. Now, I haven't really thought about how those mechanisms affect behavior regarding the question that we are addressing in this paper. So I would need to think a bit about it, but I would say that ultimately the decision whether to take a loan or to make this sanitation investment is being made by a particular household. And I don't think there is a practice of sharing toilets among neighbors. So I don't think there is much scope for other neighbors contributing to the cost or influencing the decision. But let me pause there and let Bansi come in to see if she has any reaction.
So I think, so in rural Indian context, I think there are very strong cost-based norms around sanitation practice. And in the work that Zaki referenced that our student is doing, she does find lots of well, quite strong cost-based influences on sanitation take-up and usage decisions. And you can also, there are also some effects that go along the cost hierarchy in ways that you would expect in the sense that I think higher rank cost behavior influences low rank cost behavior. So from what I understand of the context and what even from qualitative work and so on, it seems these cost-based norms are probably, they're talked about a lot more than gender-based norms. Things like knowledge about health externalities and so on. I think we see that people, at least the report being quite knowledgeable that they do expect these, there will be these types of health externalities. Don't think we saw any differences by gender. This was one of the variables we collected information on. And I think the spillovers across households, we're also looking at further work just on spillovers within the microcredit groups. And again, this is all in progress. I think it's more complicated to try to pin down the mechanisms of spillovers, but yeah, I don't have anything further to add than that.
Great, thanks, Bansi. No, this is really interesting, and yeah, it definitely is more difficult to pin down spillovers, this type of question. Okay, I think we should probably wrap up. But thanks so much, everyone, for the presentations. It's been a really enjoyable session, and I've really enjoyed all the questions and discussion afterwards as well. So hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll also just flag that if people do want to discuss this further, you could either hang out in this Zoom link for another 5 minutes, or you could head over to GatherTown now or later today, I think. Hope I haven't said anything wrong. But yeah, thanks very much, everyone, and thanks for coming to the session, to all the attendees as well, and thanks to the presenters. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
all. Bye.